Hello again, Eileen here at Avenidas. I'm going to read another story. This one's a little bit longer, but it's quite interesting. It's called Lunch with Helen Keller. My husband and I loved our house in Italy. It sat high on a cliff above Portofino with an extraordinary view of the blue harbor below, and its white beach was surrounded by cypresses. There was, however, a serpent in our paradise, the path up the hill. The municipal authorities refused to grant us permission to build a proper road in lieu of the mule track. The only vehicle that could climb the narrow path and negotiate the hairpin turns, the steep incline, and the potholes was an old American Army Jeep we had bought in Genoa. It possessed neither springs nor brakes. When you wanted to stop, you had to go into reverse and back up over something. But it was indestructible, and you could rely on it in all weather. One day in the summer of 1950, our neighbor, Contessa Margot, who was of necessity also owned a Jeep, called to say that her cousin had arrived in town with a companion and that her own Jeep had conked out. Would I mind going to fetch the two old ladies in our Jeep? They were at the Hotel Splendido. Whom shall I ask for at the hotel? I asked. Ask for Miss Helen Keller. Who? Miss Helen Keller, she said. K-E-L-L. Margot, you don't mean the Helen Keller, do you? Well, of course, she said. She's my cousin. Didn't you know? I ran into the garage, jumped into the Jeep, and raced down the mountain. I had been 12 years old when my father gave me the book about Helen Keller, written by Anne Sullivan, the remarkable woman whom fate had chosen to be the teacher of the blind and deaf child. Anne Sullivan had turned the rebellious Brutus little child into a civilized member of society by teaching her to speak. I still remembered vividly her description of the last few months of the physical battle with the child until the glorious moment when she held Helen's left hand under running water and the blind, deaf, and up until then mute little girl made history by stammering out an intelligible word, water. Over the years, I had read about Helen Keller in the newspapers. I knew that Anne Sullivan was no longer with her and that a new companion now accompanied her everywhere. But the few minutes it took for me to drive down the hill were not nearly enough to get used to the idea that I was going to meet in person this mystical figure from my early youth. I backed the Jeep up against a bougainvillea-covered wall and presented myself at the hotel. A tall, vigorous-looking young woman rose up from a chair on the hotel terrace to greet me. Polly Thompson, Helen Keller's companion. A second figure rose slowly from the chair beside her and held out her hand. Helen Keller. Then, in her 70s, was a slight, white-haired woman with wide-open blue eyes and a shy smile. How do you do? She said slowly and a little gutturally. I took her hand, which she was holding too high because she didn't know how tall I was. She was bound to make this mistake with people she was meeting for the very first time, but she never made it twice. Later, when we said goodbye, she put her hand firmly into mine at exactly the right level. The luggage was loaded into the back of the Jeep, and I helped the jolly Miss Thompson to sit beside it. The hotel porter lifted Helen Keller's frail body and set it down on the front seat next to me. Only then did it dawn on me that this was going to be a risky undertaking. The Jeep was open. There was nothing you could hold on to properly. How was I to keep the blind and deaf woman from falling out of this rickety old Jeep, especially when we took a curve or went down a bumpy area? I turned to her and I said, Miss Keller, I must prepare you. We're going up a very steep hill. Can you hold tight to this piece of metal on the windshield? But she continued to look expectantly straight ahead. Behind me, Miss Thompson said patiently, she can't hear you, dear, nor see you. I know it's hard to get used to it at first. I was so embarrassed that I stammered like an idiot, trying to explain the problem ahead of us. All the while, Miss Keller never turned her head or seemed puzzled by the delay. She sat motionless, a slight smile on her face, patiently waiting. Miss Thompson knelt across the luggage and reached for her hand. Rapidly, she moved Helen's fingers up and down and sideways, telling her in blind deaf language what I must have just said. "I don't mind," said Helen, laughing. "I'll hold tight." It took courage. I got hold of her hands and placed them on the piece of metal in front of her. "Okay," she cried gaily, and I switched on the ignition. The Jeep started with a jump, and Miss Thompson fell off her seat on top of the luggage. I couldn't stop and help her up because of the steep hill, the dangerous curve ahead, and the absence of brakes. We roared upward, my eyes glued to the narrow path, and Miss Thompson, helpless as a beetle, on its back. I'd had plenty of passengers in the Jeep, and they'd all complained about the lack of springs. No wonder, with all these boulders and potholes, not to mention the hairpin turns through the olive trees, which only partially obscured the precipitous drop that had unnerved quite a few of our guests. Helen was the first passenger who was oblivious to the danger. She was enchanted by the violent jumps and only laughed when she was thrown against my shoulder. Helen actually began to sing. "This is fun," she warbled happily, bouncing up and down. "Lovely," she cried. We tore past our house at breakneck speed. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw our gardener, Giuseppe, crossing himself with the sign of the cross, and continued onward and upward. I had no idea how Miss Thompson was doing, for the Jeep's fearful roar had long ago drowned out her anguished protests. But I knew that Helen was still next to me. Her thin white hair had become undone and fluttered about her face, and she was enjoying the crazy ride like a child riding up and down on a wooden horse or on a merry-go-round. At last we rounded that last curve between two giant fig trees. I could see Margot and her husband waiting for us at the entrance gate. Helen was lifted out of the Jeep and hugged. The luggage was unloaded and Miss Thompson upended and dusted off. I was invited to lunch. While the two old ladies were being shown to their rooms to freshen up, Margot told me about her cousin and her life. Helen was famous the world over and in every civilized country. The great and the renowned were eager to meet her and do something for her. Heads of state, scholars, and artists vied to receive her, and she had traveled all over the world to satisfy her burning curiosity. "But don't forget," said Margot, "all she really notices is a change of smell." The two old ladies walked through the garden toward the terrace where we were waiting for them. "Well, that must be wisteria," Helen said, "and masses of it too. I recognize the scent." I went to pick a large bunch of the blossoms which surrounded the terrace and laid it in her lap. "I knew it," she cried happily, touching them. Of course, Helen's diction was not quite normal. She spoke haltingly, like someone who had had a stroke, and her consonants were slow and labored. She turned to me, looking directly at me because she had sensed where I was sitting. "You know, you're on the way to Florence to see Michelangelo's David. I'm so thrilled. I've always wanted to see it." Mystified, I looked at Miss Thompson, who nodded. "It's true, the Italian government has had a scaffolding erected around the statue so that Helen can climb up and touch it. That's what she's calling seeing. We often go to the theater in New York and I tell her what's going on stage and describe the actors. Sometimes we go backstage too so that she can see the sets and the actors. Then she goes home feeling that she's really witnessed the performance." All the time we were talking, Helen sat and waited. Now and then, when our conversation went on too long, I saw her thin fingers take her friend's hand inquiringly, never impatiently. Luncheon was served on the terrace. Helen was led to her chair, and I watched her see her place setting. Quick as lightning, her hands moved over the objects on the table, plate, glass, silverware, memorizing where they were. Never once during the meal did she grope about. She reached out casually and firmly, just like the rest of us. After lunch, we stayed on the shady terrace, surrounded by trailing clusters of wisteria, like a thick mauve curtain, the sun below us glittering on the sea. Helen sat in the usual way, head raised slightly as though listening to something, her sightless blue eyes wide open. Her face, although an old lady's face, had something of a schoolgirl's innocence. Whatever suffering must have tormented her, and might still torment her for all we knew, her face showed no trace of it. It was an isolated face, a saintly face. I asked her, through her friend, what she wanted to see while she was in Italy. Then she slowly mapped out her Italian journey, all the places she wanted to visit and the people she would meet. Incredibly, she spoke French quite well and could make herself understood in German and Italian. Sculpture was naturally her favorite form of art because she could touch it and experience it firsthand. There's still so much I'd like to see, she said, so much to learn, and death is just around the corner for me. Not that that worries me, quite the contrary. Well, do you believe in life after death, I asked her. Most certainly, she said emphatically. It is no more than passing from one room into the next room. Suddenly, we sat in silence. Helen spoke again. Slowly and very distinctly, she said, but there's a difference for me, you know, because in that other room, the next room, I shall be able to see. So that's the end of our story about Helen Keller. That's neat. This was written by Lily Palmer. I like that story a lot. Bye now.